On May 23, 1981, the entire surviving population of a species that had lived on this planet for 60 million years fit inside a single tree. Not a forest, not a valley. One tree above one farm plot in one mountain village in Shaanxi province. 2 breeding pairs and 3 fledglings, nested together on branches that could be reached by a single snake on a single night. That was the complete global inventory. That was what remained. By 2024, there were more than 10,000 of them. And the mountain range surrounding that village had been transformed into 16,000 square kilometers of recovered wilderness that no government program had designed, no reforestation initiative had engineered, and no conservation budget had funded. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how 7 birds legally dismantled an industrial economy, replaced it with a multi-billion yuan organic monopoly, and passively rebuilt an entire degraded mountain range across 4 decades. And it will permanently change how you think about what conservation actually requires. But here is the detail that the standard institutional accounts consistently omit. The birds did not survive because China built a sanctuary. They survived because China destroyed a farming system. Think about that distinction carefully. The documented record on this recovery is specific and verifiable. The ornithologist at the center of this story, Liu Yinzeng, was a field researcher attached to the Institute of Zoology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the senior national body for biological research in the People's Republic. His assignment in 1981 was not to search for survivors. It was to complete the paperwork confirming an extinction. He had already spent 3 years and more than 50,000 kilometers moving across 14 provinces, following every historical record, every known breeding site, every credible lead. Every single one had gone cold. The scientific consensus across China, Japan, Korea, and Russia was settled. The crested ibis, Nipponia nippon, was functionally gone from the wild. He had already drafted the report. The mainstream explanation for this collapse is accurate and well supported. 20th century industrial agriculture had by the 1970s flooded the shallow terraced rice paddies of East Asia with synthetic pesticides and chemical nitrogen fertilizers. The crested ibis is a hyper-specialized feeder, dependent entirely on mud-dwelling invertebrates, loaches, frogs, freshwater crabs, that cannot survive in chemically saturated soil. Simultaneously, commercial logging operations had systematically stripped the tall, broadleaf trees the species required for nesting. The convergence was not gradual. It was systemic and fast, and it hit every known population cluster within the same decade. By 1980, verified sightings across the entire range had dropped to 0. The scientific community had conducted its due diligence. The file was closed. Liu Yinzeng requested one more field visit, not because the data suggested anything, because a local forestry officer in Yangqian County had passed along a second-hand account from a mountain village, vague, unconfirmed, the kind of rural rumor that had sent field researchers on wasted expeditions dozens of times over the previous 3 years. Liu did not believe it. He went anyway. And what he found above that farm plot in Yaojiagu village was not what anyone in that search program had prepared for. Before we reveal the severe agricultural mandate that altered this landscape, we need to map the ground truth of this crisis. Drop a comment right now with the state or country you are watching from, and let us know if industrial development has wiped out the native wildlife in your local region. Subscribing to Prime Discoveries ensures you stay pinned to the data as we track the ecological shifts mainstream agencies refuse to publish. Now, back to the mountains, because the immediate policy changes were about to trigger a profound local crisis. Now here is what you need to understand about what Liu Yinzeng was actually looking at when he raised his binoculars above that farm plot in Yaojiagu village. Not a flock, not a remnant breeding colony, 7 birds, 2 breeding pairs and 3 fledglings, all of them clustered inside a single oriental oak tree, exposed to the open sky, accessible from the ground, and entirely unaware that a field researcher from the Chinese Academy of Sciences had just become the only person on Earth who knew they existed. That was the complete biological inheritance of 60 million years of evolutionary history. 1 tree, 7 animals, 0 margin for a single bad night. Liu Yinzeng later described the moment not as triumph, but as terror. The particular, paralyzing terror of a man who understands population genetics and realizes that what he is staring at is not a discovery. It is a countdown. The Yangqian County government moved in 4 days. 4 days from notification to the deployment of a formal administrative protection apparatus. Local officials establishing a security perimeter, issuing emergency field directives, and mobilizing personnel to begin round-the-clock monitoring of a single tree in a mountain farming village. When a bureaucratic institution moves that fast, it is not responding to an opportunity. It is responding to the recognition that any further delay would make the entire operation pointless. But the fence they built around that tree solved exactly one problem. And the problem that remained, the slow, chemical, invisible one happening across every rice paddy and every hillside within the birds' foraging range, was not a problem that any perimeter could stop. The birds were protected. The land that fed them was still being systematically destroyed. And that contradiction was about to force a decision that would alter the economic trajectory of an entire region for the next 4 decades. The chemical inputs that promised to save the farmers were guaranteed to slaughter the birds. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct biological fact, and the research team understood it immediately. The crested ibis does not eat grain. It does not eat insects from dry land. It forages exclusively in the shallow, muddy water columns of traditional wetland rice paddies, hunting the loaches, freshwater crabs, and small frogs that live in chemically untreated soil. Remove the chemicals and the birds can eat. Add them and the food chain collapses completely, not partially, not gradually. The invertebrate population in a chemically treated paddy does not decline. It disappears. And in 1981, chemical fertilizers and synthetic pesticides were not optional upgrades for rural Chinese farmers. They were the mandated direction of national agricultural modernization. Every neighboring county was converting. Every provincial directive pointed the same way. The financial logic was unambiguous. Higher yields, lower labor costs, faster growth. The farmers of Yangshan County had been watching that transformation move toward them for years, and they were ready to participate in it. The government drew a hard line, a total prohibition. No synthetic pesticides, no chemical fertilizers, no firearms within the foraging zone, no commercial logging on the surrounding slopes. Not a reduction, not a phased transition. A complete ban, effective immediately, enforced by administrative authority, with no scheduled end date. The birds were protected. The farming economy of an entire county was frozen in place. While the rest of rural China modernized and its agricultural output scaled, the villages surrounding Yaojiagu were legally required to farm as if it were still 1960, by hand, with traditional inputs, at lower yields, for no additional compensation. For 20 years, that is exactly what they did. And no one, not the scientists, not the government officials, not the farmers themselves, had any idea what that sacrifice was quietly building. What happened next inside Yangshan County took 40 years to fully understand. In the immediate term, the protection operation was as physical and as intimate as conservation work ever gets. The 4-man team stationed beneath the nesting tree did not work in rotation from a distant monitoring post. They lived there. A base camp was established directly at the base of the oriental oak, close enough that the men on night watch could hear the birds shift their weight on the branches overhead. They documented every movement. They logged weather conditions, predator activity, and behavioral patterns with the methodical consistency of a clinical trial, because in biological terms, that is precisely what it was. A trial with no control group and no second attempt. The snake problem was not theoretical. The mountain slopes surrounding Yaojiagu supported healthy populations of arboreal predators, fully capable of ascending a tree trunk at night and reaching a nest before any ground-based observer could intervene. The solution the protection team developed was not sophisticated. It was effective. They painted the lower bark of the nesting tree with a combination of slick chemical compounds and, in documented field accounts, actual butter, creating a physical surface that denied traction to anything attempting to climb. Not a technological intervention, not a government program. 4 men with a bucket, working in rotation, keeping 60 million years of evolutionary history alive, one greased trunk at a time. The 3 original fledglings survived. They matured, they bred. But while that single tree was being guarded with the attentiveness of a military installation, the families farming the surrounding paddies were absorbing the full economic weight of a mandate they had not requested and could not appeal. Lower yields, higher labor, no compensation, no timeline. To follow a trail of ecological evidence this deeply buried requires an audience base that values empirical data over standard corporate narratives. If you demand this level of investigative ground truth, take a single second to hit the subscribe button right now and join our biological research collective. Now, look closely at the timelines. Because the economic penalty of the 1980s was about to trigger an unprecedented financial windfall. It was, in immediate economic terms, a massive step backward until the global market shifted. For 2 decades, the farmers of Yangshan County had absorbed their penalty in silence. No chemical inputs, no industrial yield multipliers, no participation in the modernization wave that had raised rural incomes across every neighboring prefecture. They farmed with animal manure and hand tools, and they watched their harvest numbers stay flat and they received nothing from the government in return except the continued enforcement of the restrictions that kept them poor. The birds were thriving, the villages were not. That was the arrangement, and there was no indication it was going to change. Then something happened that no agricultural economist, no conservation biologist, and no government planner had modeled for. China's middle class grew. It grew fast and it grew wealthy, and as it did, it developed a specific and escalating anxiety about the safety of its food supply. By the early 2000s, urban Chinese consumers were paying significant premiums for certified chemical-free produce, not because they had been persuaded to, but because the industrial food system generated enough contamination scandals and health scares to make verified clean sourcing one of the highest value attributes a food product could carry. The demand was real, it was large, and it was growing faster than any certified supply chain could meet it. The farmers of Yangzheng County had spent 20 years creating, entirely involuntarily, the most comprehensively verified chemical-free agricultural soil in the People's Republic. Not because they had pursued organic certification, because a bird had made it legally impossible for them to farm any other way. The certification process, when it was applied to Yangzheng County's farmlands, produced results that surprised even the agricultural scientists conducting the assessments. The soil and water matrices were not merely low in synthetic residues. They were clean in a way that required 20-plus consecutive years of zero chemical input to achieve. No other farming region in China could replicate that profile on any timeline that mattered commercially. The county did not have a competitive organic product. It had a monopoly. And the brand that emerged from that monopoly, IBIS certified organic rice, carrying the image of Nipponia Nippon as its quality seal, was not a marketing creation. It was a biological credential. By 2021, the IBIS certified organic farmlands of Yangzheng County covered more than 32,000 hectares and were generating billions of yuan in direct annual revenue for the villages that had spent 2 decades farming at a loss to protect a bird they had never been asked about. Consider the shape of what just happened. A total ban on modern agriculture, imposed to protect 7 birds in 1981, accidentally created 20 years of verified chemical-free soil accumulation that could not be manufactured or accelerated by any other method, producing a premium agricultural monopoly worth billions in the exact market window when clean food certification commanded its highest premium in Chinese economic history. Not designed, not planned, compounded. But here is the problem that the economic transformation did not solve. The ibis population was growing, but it was growing slowly, dangerously slowly for a species still operating from an original genetic base of 7 individuals. The crested ibis does not reach sexual maturity until its 3rd year of life. It raises a single clutch per breeding season. Its natural reproductive rate, even under optimal conditions, is one of the lowest of any large bird species in East Asia. The farming economy was secured. The genetic arithmetic was not. The land had been saved. The biology was still a race against time. The numbers that came back from the laboratory tracking logs removed any remaining room for skepticism. The problem was genetic. A founding population of 7 individuals, 2 breeding pairs, carries a catastrophically narrow allelic base. Every subsequent generation bred within that pool compounds the inbreeding coefficient. The mathematics are unforgiving. Without external genetic inputs, without a mechanism to diversify the hereditary material, a small closed population does not stabilize. It degrades. Immune function weakens. Developmental abnormalities accumulate. Chick mortality climbs. The population can grow in raw numbers and still be collapsing from the inside. That was the trajectory the Shaanxi Provincial Rare Wildlife Rescue Base was tasked with reversing. Lead researcher Zhang Jinfeng and her team did not attempt to accelerate the crested ibis's natural reproductive cycle. They bypassed it entirely. Artificial incubation protocols allowed eggs to be removed from nests and brought to term under controlled conditions, freeing the breeding pairs to produce additional clutches within the same season. A behavior the species does not exhibit naturally. Hand-rearing programs substituted human caretakers for parent birds during the critical imprinting window, using ibis-costumed handlers to prevent the chicks from bonding with humans in ways that would compromise their eventual release viability. It was painstaking, labor-intensive, and documented at every stage. It worked. By the mid-2000s, the captive breeding network had expanded across 6 national bases, producing hundreds of genetically managed chicks annually. The inbreeding crisis was not eliminated. It was structurally interrupted. This biological verification has scaled from a single mountain valley across entire international borders. For those of you watching from states or rural farming communities across the American South or Midwest, Let us know in the comments if you have noticed a sudden change in your local bird populations following changes in local pesticide use. Now, the transformation did not stop at mere laboratory cages, because the birds emerging from those facilities needed somewhere to go. But the transformation running through the Qinling Mountains was not purely agricultural. The logging ban imposed in 1981 to protect the watershed feeding the ibis foraging paddies was not a reforestation program. No trees were planted, no hillsides were terraced for erosion control, no river corridors were engineered for habitat connectivity. The mandate was simply an absence. An instruction to stop cutting, stop foraging, stop disturbing, applied across mountain slopes that had been commercially logged for decades and left in a state of significant degradation. The expectation, if there was one, was that the protected area would stabilize, hold what it had, prevent further loss. What actually happened was something the conservation literature had theorized but rarely documented at this scale. The forest came back, not partially, comprehensively. Without human assistance, without a planting budget, without a restoration plan of any kind, the broadleaf woodland ecosystems of the Qinling Range began their slow autonomous recovery the moment human extraction pressure was removed. Root systems that logging had left intact began regenerating canopy. Silted river channels cleared as the vegetation holding the surrounding slopes took hold again. Riparian corridors reconnected. The invertebrate communities in the streams, freed from the sediment loads that degraded forest produced, rebuilt their populations. The habitat, given only time and the removal of disruption, rebuilt itself. By 2022, the documented protected habitat zone surrounding the original Yaoyagu site had expanded from less than 5 square kilometers to more than 16,000, not 500. Not 1,000. 16,000 square kilometers of recovered functional ecosystem, produced by 40 years of enforced human absence and nothing else. The landscape that had been a dying fragment in 1981 had quietly become one of the largest continuous protected wilderness zones in central China. And this is the fact that forces an uncomfortable reckoning, because it means every species the scientific community had written off as a casualty of that landscape's destruction may have been written off too soon. That data is not a regional fairy tale. The population census logs maintained by the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the State Forestry Administration tracked the crested ibis count with individual-level precision across every breeding season from 1981 forward. The numbers from the early years were almost unbearable to read. 7, then 11, then 30, then 60. Each increment representing years of sustained guard rotations, enforced agricultural sacrifice, and captive breeding protocols that had no guaranteed outcome. The scientific consensus at the time of the Yaoyagu discovery held that a founding population of 7 individuals was not a rescue scenario. It was a delayed extinction. The inbreeding mathematics were considered definitive. The species, by every standard population viability model in use in 1981, was already functionally over. The models were wrong. By the mid-1990s, the combined wild and captive population had passed 1,000. By the 2010s, it had passed 5,000, distributed across multiple provinces and 2 reintroduction sites. By 2024, the total global population of Nipponia nippon, the species whose extinction paperwork had been drafted in 1981, whose entire remaining genetic heritage had fit inside a single tree, had officially exceeded 10,000 individual birds. Liu Yinzeng lived to see it. The man who had stood beneath that oriental oak in Yaoyagu village, struck not by triumph but by terror, lived long enough to watch the species he had found in its final hours cross a threshold that mainstream population science had declared biologically impossible from its starting point. 7 to 10,000 in 43 years from a single tree. The domestic chapter of this story was closed, but the birds had not stayed in China. Beginning in the 1990s, the Chinese government began transferring breeding pairs to Japan as a diplomatic gesture between 2 nations with a shared historical relationship to this species. A gift that landed on a small island called Sado, where it triggered a sequence of events that almost no one in the original reintroduction program had anticipated. In our next video, we travel directly to Japan, where that small population of these exact same birds, provided as a high-stakes diplomatic gift between 2 governments, landed on Sado Island, triggered an agricultural and political revolution that absolutely no one had planned for. If you thought 7 ibises rebuilding the mountains of northwest China was unbelievable, wait until you see what the same species did to the rice economy of Japan. Click right here to open the Sado Island file. Drop your thoughts below alongside your location and subscribe to the channel. We will see you in the next investigation.